Hello, welcome to Conversations with Dr. Stephen Greer, and this is Dr. Greer speaking, and I'd like to thank the World Puja Network folks for hosting us every 2 weeks here, and they're very generous to give us this time to share with you what is happening with CSETI and the Disclosure Project and the OrionProject.org, and today I am joined with Linda Willitts, who's worked with the CSETI and the Disclosure Project for about 12 years on all of our projects. And thank you, Linda, for joining us.
You're welcome.
So we're going to be focusing today on the Disclosure Project and sort of an update. Many people have written in asking, what is going on globally with disclosure. And I think it's important that people get an update, because there have been a number of things that have happened just in the last year or two that we really have not focused on yet on these programs. So one of the things, just to overview this, if you go to disclosureproject.org, which is our website, you'll see that the Disclosure Project is a project of the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and it's a nonprofit 501c3 charity that we founded 20 years ago this year in 1990 to establish peaceful diplomatic relations with extraterrestrial civilizations, and also to disclose the fact that we're not alone in the universe to the public. And the Disclosure Project actually was a result of having had successful contact occur back in the early 90s, and then the question was being asked, well, what do we do from here? And that we decided it was very important to get out to the public and educate the public about the fact that we are not alone, and that to encourage the governments of the world to end the secrecy on this subject and bring out the information to the people that they've been sitting on in classified projects for so many decades. And as a result of that, the Disclosure Project was founded. And so that was back in the early 90s. And disclosureproject.org is the website where a lot of that information, and also the testimony of many of these people who are top-secret military and corporate and intelligence witnesses have their testimony, and the evidence is contained there, as well as links to other events around the world dealing with disclosure. So that's sort of a brief overview.
Well, this is Linda. One of the things that I'd like to point out, in case some of the listeners aren't aware of it, is that Dr. Greer is the father of UFO disclosure. He coined the term disclosure back in 2001 when we created the Disclosure Project. And even, as he said, way back in the early 90s, when he first started CSETI, he had what was called Project Starlight at that time, which was the predecessor, really, of the Disclosure Project. And it was during that time that he started gathering witnesses. And you might want to tell them how that witness gathering process took place.
Well, yeah, it actually started, I think Disclosure Project, I named it back in the 90s, actually, before 2001.
Okay.
We started filming them in 2000 with our cameras and taking their testimony. And the way it all really began was, I know last time, Linda, you and I spoke about the amazing things that happened in 1992 in Florida, where we're going to be having this gathering on Boca Grande Island next month in February. And basically, it was an astonishing event that took place near Pensacola, where I had about 50 people. We were training in the CSETI contact protocols, and we had 4 extraterrestrial vehicles appear and interacted with us for quite a length of time, around half an hour or more, out there on the beach near the Gulf of Mexico. In fact, we were right on the edge of the Gulf of Mexico. And then following that, we had a landing of a craft in England, about a 100-foot diameter disc, in the summer of 1992 in Alton Barnes, England. And subsequent to that, we went to Mexico near the big volcano Popo. It has a very long Indian name that I never get straight, but I think they call it Popocatépetl or something like this. It's the giant 18,000-foot volcano, fourth largest volcano in the world that's outside Mexico City. And then, so we had gone in the winter of 1993 on an expedition there with our contact team, with Sherry Adamak and myself and a few other people. And we had this massive triangular craft that was attended with actually accompanied by a disc-shaped craft that appeared and came over to us and signaled and circled us for quite some time back in 1993. And it was after those events, so well within, about a 12-month period between March of 1992 and March of 1993, that it became quite clear that the CSETI contact protocols worked. And the question began to be, my God, what are we going to do with this? Because not only is the public at that time were very much less aware of the UFO matter than they are today, but there was no governments around the world really opening up any files or discussing this openly in the least. And so there was a man who had worked in very high circles in the U.S. military who had approached me, and to make a long story short, he is still with us, working with us, and he actually approached me in 1991, I believe it was, and said, look, we really need to put some briefings together for senior people in the military and in the government so that they understand what you're doing, and so also so that there's no conflict over the airspace and over what's happening, so they don't mistake what you're doing for something that they would interfere with. And we had a meeting back in the summer of '93 here in the countryside of Virginia, long before I moved here. And what we decided to do was to gather together some people who had been in government circles. There were people there who had been in the State Department. This man had been his whole career in the military, and we discussed, how do we disclose this information to the public? How do we get the governments to begin to open up their files and end the secrecy on this issue? And so in 1993, we started this effort. And decided first that we would provide this information to in a comprehensive assessment and a briefing to the current president, who was then Bill Clinton, and also to his science advisor, Jack Gibbons, as well as to some of the senior military officials in the Pentagon that we had access to, and encourage an end to the secrecy, and also to let them know that CSETI was making contact and that they should view it as a diplomatic effort and that it should not be interfered with. And I think that was the genesis. And later, in the fall of 1993, as you all know from my autobiography, Hidden Truth, Forbidden Knowledge, you'll see that there's this account of being out at the Rockefeller Ranch out in the Tetons, where I was asked to come by Lawrence Rockefeller, who was hosting quite a few people in the intelligence community, and Lawrence Rockefeller offered to provide host President Clinton and Hillary Clinton at the Rockefeller Ranch to go through this information, and also to begin to assist with disclosing this subject. Now, of course, this is all documented in my book. At that point, around that time, in September of 1993, a man approached me at a lecture I was giving in Colorado at the International Association of New Science, that Dr. Brian O'Leary, who is an Apollo astronaut, was one of the founders, along with Maury Albertson, who recently passed away, a wonderful man, visionary, who actually was one of the original co-founders of the Peace Corps. So Maury Albertson and Dr. Brian O'Leary and Bob Silverud were hosting this International Association for New Science back in the early 90s, and I was a guest speaker. And after my talk there, a man approached me who said that he really felt that what we were proposing, which was an end of the secrecy and to bring this information out and to get senior officials in the government, not only in the U.S. but around the world, involved, that it was time to do that. And he said he knew a few people in Washington who he thinks need to know about this, and that he would be willing to help set up some of those meetings. And I said, well, who are these people? And he said, well, I'm personal friends with the director of Central Intelligence, the CIA director. And I laughed. I said, well, that's a good start. And so from there, the name of the initial effort was called Project Starlight. And last year, about a year ago, the Associated Press, the AP, reported that out of the Clinton Library from a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit, not initiated by us but by some others, they released some of the documents from the Clinton White House regarding this mysterious Project Starlight. Well, Project Starlight was my project that I started back in 1993 that was the predecessor to now what's known as the Disclosure Project and the Worldwide Disclosure and Exopolitics Movement. So what happened, of course, as a result of all these initiatives in the early 90s was that I did brief the Director of Central Intelligence. We put together a very large briefing for the President and his science advisor and his national security advisor, Tony Lake. There were people in the White House very close to President Clinton who were political folks who also helped set up meetings with senior members of Congress for us. And we were encouraging the United Nations at the time, Boutros Boutros-Ghali, the head of the Secretary General of the United Nations, and his wife were very interested in this. And so I went to New York and met with Boutros-Ghali and with Mrs. Boutros-Ghali, and they were very supportive of the idea of this information coming out. And so we were building a network behind the scenes. At that point, a lot of these things were being done very quietly. What we wanted to do first was to get the official governments on board and have them do it. But it turned out that, of course, this is all a matter of history now and hidden truth, forbidden knowledge, that President Clinton was very intimidated by taking on this multi-trillion-dollar, multi-hundred-trillion-dollar interest group that wants this stuff kept secret. They did not want these technologies known. They did not want it known that we weren't alone in the universe, because with that knowledge comes the fact that the so-called UFOs are flying around using energy and propulsion systems that would replace jet fuel and gasoline and coal-fired power plants and what have you. And there you get right to the nexus, the center of the problem, and that is how power is then accumulated and used on this planet. And it's a lot more power than the presidency actually has control over. So between 1993 and 1998, we began this process of briefing not only the president but senior members of Congress. I met with members of the Senate Intelligence Committee. I met with Foreign Affairs Committee, House Government and Oversight, the chairman, Dan Burton, and others. And basically, we're encouraging that there be either an open hearing in the Congress or an executive order from the President to bring this information out. When it became clear to me in 1998 that officialdom was not going to take on an issue this controversial or this large, that it would really then fall on our shoulders to do it, we started. Project Starlight became the Disclosure Project somewhere during those years. Starlight became the Disclosure Project, and the Disclosure Project was started because we realized that, unfortunately, the United States was not in a position to have leaders of adequate courage or vision or access, for that matter, to do this. And so I was told by a friend of the president's at the time that he wouldn't do it and couldn't do it, but they felt I could. And basically Lawrence Rockefeller said the same thing to me when I was out on his deck out at the Rockefeller Ranch in the Grand Tetons. And they felt that because I was not a member of the government and had no official standing, but I had access to a lot of information and also a lot of top-secret military and intelligence witnesses, that we should do it. Now, I know, of course, a lot of that was sort of a duck and let the pie hit me in the face instead of them, because it was made very clear to me that one of the things that was stated up front at the time was that they were concerned that if the president did what I was recommending in the briefing that I did for his CIA director, R. James Woolsey, that he would end up like Jack Kennedy. And I, at the time, thought they were joking and laughed, and then I came to realize very quickly they were not joking. and that basically they viewed me as expendable, that they didn't really care if something terrible happened to me. They did care if something terrible happened to the president. So as a result of that, I decided to push forward because I'm not someone who's easily intimidated, anyone who knows me. And so I said, well, then if they won't do it, we will. And when it became clear that there were also no members of Congress who wanted to hold a hearing on this, now it was clear at the time there were people interested. I have to say, many people were interested, and getting access to these sort of leaders was not a problem, and still isn't. The big problem is getting them to do anything about it, because everyone wants to know, but nobody wants to act. And so as a result of this, what happened was that we founded the Disclosure Project, and you can see disclosureproject.org, and started what is now, of course, the Global Disclosure Movement. Now, there's a lot of work that went behind the scenes. I mean, it would take many hours of conversation to sort of go into all the detail, and some of this is recounted in the book Hidden Truth, Forbidden Knowledge, which you can get at disclosureproject.org, which is sort of an autobiography, as I mentioned, but it recounts many of these sorts of experiences. And what I learned as I went around the world, not just in the United States, but to the Vatican, to Paris, to London, all over, and saw how secrecy was maintained on this, and who was keeping it secret, and why they were keeping it secret. But through this, I began to put out a call publicly for military and intelligence witnesses and people who'd worked in corporations who had firsthand knowledge of the secrecy or of operations or events, and who were willing to testify openly. And initially we just had a few of them, and then we had a dozen, and then we had 40, and then we had 100, and at this point in 2010 we have hundreds of these sorts of military and intelligence witnesses, and it's just an enormous number of sources of information that we've been able to develop over the last 16 to 17 years. And so in 2001, as you all know, we had at the National Press Club in Washington had a event where over 20 of these military and intelligence witnesses, some of whom had also worked in corporate areas, stood before the world and testified to what they knew and called for an end to the secrecy and to this information coming out. That event was, at the time, the most watched Internet broadcast in history. It was eventually seen all over the world on almost every network, including throughout China, Russia. It was reported in Pravda, CNN International, the BBC, the Voice of America had a whole show about it, et cetera, and so on. And thus launched the global disclosure and exopolitics movement. So this is sort of just the last 10 or 15 minutes. I just want to give people a sort of a sense of the history of it, but it was a very, very interesting time and exciting time, obviously, for all of us. And it took a lot of work to identify these people, but the way that it really had happened was because we were the default position. And what I mean by that is that what our preference had been was to, as we put these briefings together, and then in these meetings I had with people like the CIA director, and I also met with the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I met with the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, very, very senior members of Congress, senators and members of the House of Representatives and chairmen of committees, and on and on and on. What I found was that nobody really wanted to take the issue on for two reasons. One is something that most people are shocked when they hear, and that is that they didn't have access or control over the projects dealing with this subject. Now, this is something that when most people hear this, don't quite understand its implications. But I just want to take you, just pretend you're sitting in a living room in the D.C. area in 1993. I'm a 30-some-year-old emergency doctor, and I've been called up to Washington to brief the sitting director of Central Intelligence, the CIA director, for a new president who took office a few months earlier in January of 1993, President Clinton. And I'm told prior to coming to this meeting in a FedExed letter that was sent to me by this man who is my point of contact to him that, in fact, I would be the first person to brief this administration and this CIA director on this subject, and that the President, Clinton, and that the CIA director had made inquiries into the matter, and they had not been provided the information, that basically they had been denied access to the information, and they certainly had no control over these projects. Now, I have to say that when I got there, I was living in North Carolina at the time, working as an emergency doctor. When I got this letter from this contact to the CIA director, I chuckled and thought this is a prevarication. I did not believe it to be true. I couldn't imagine, frankly, that a CIA director or a president would be denied access to operations going on in classified projects under their own noses. But by the time I finished the meeting with the CIA director, I had no doubt in my mind that that was the case. I had no doubt in my mind that, in fact, there existed a black project, a so-called unacknowledged special access project, or a number of them, that routinely deceived or lied to the president and to members of Congress or to even a CIA director, and would basically, even under a directed inquiry from the CIA director and president, tell them that nothing was happening or didn't exist or push them aside, and that this constituted not only a rogue action, an illegal action, but an illegal satellite government or secret government that superseded the existing elected and appointed government of the United States. This was an enormous, and this was not a conspiracy theory that I was reading about on the Internet. This was what I was living. This was my life. And it isn't as if I was getting this, 10th hand from a low-level munchkin at the CIA. This is from meeting with the director of the CIA himself. So what I concluded from this was that when I did at the end of this meeting with the CIA director, I said, well, here's what we're recommending. We think that this issue should be disclosed. We think that it needs to be looked at very carefully. And I'll never forget the CIA director saying, how do I disclose and how does the president disclose that which we have no access to? And that's an existential thing to meditate, to think about. Meditate on that for a minute. You see, everyone thinks that just because you're the CIA director or the president, you have access to everything. Well, you do not. And this is what I didn't realize at the time, and which I came to realize in 1993. So that was a tragedy. And of course, it's a tragedy that started in the 50s, I learned later from the Eisenhower era, when he warned us, beware the military-industrial complex. He's the one who said that, is President Eisenhower, a five-star general and World War II hero. And yet, this continued and was still reverberating through history up to the 90s and, in fact, up to today, where just because you're the president or the CIA director or even a senior military general, if you're not, quote, read into one of these compartmentalized projects, they don't tell you about it because that's what an unacknowledged or super black project is. It doesn't matter if you have a top secret clearance. Tons of people have top secret clearances, and no one should have a higher clearance than the President of the United States. But as we have since learned, Jimmy Carter himself had been denied access to this information. And so what we find out is that there is sort of a parallel super secret government that supersedes and trumps the access that the Congress or the President or the appointed heads of these big agencies, such as the CIA or the Department of Defense, have. And once this was not only made very clear to me, and it wasn't just one person I spoke to, it was multiple people in Congress as well as at the Pentagon, at the CIA, and in other governments, I might add, then I concluded that the only way to fix this problem was for a civilian group, a non-governmental organization, an NGO such as ours, CSETI and Disclosure Project, to gather together courageous men and women who had seen parts of what was going on with these programs, put them together in one place, assemble their testimony, and bring it out to the world. And that's what we did. And so, but the backstory is this really kind of mind-boggling journey, which I recount in Hidden Truth, Forbidden Knowledge, of having gone around the world meeting with people like the ones I just mentioned, and finding out that there was a very consistent pattern, and that is that this thing was so secret and it had gotten so out of control that even, for example, when I met with the 5-star admiral in the United Kingdom who had been head of the Ministry of Defense there, as well as was head of the military committee for NATO back some years ago, Lord Hill Norton, he told me, as I sat in his living room in Hampshire, that, and this was back in the 1990s as well, that he had completely had no knowledge of these operations, even though he was head of the Ministry of Defense, and as such in the United Kingdom was also head of MI5 and MI6, the equivalent of our CIA director. So he was very angry, frankly, and he was furious that he could have been so deceived. And, of course, I pointed out to him that, he was in very good company, that the current president of the United States, Bill Clinton, and his CIA director were in the same boat, as had been Jimmy Carter and many others. I then later, of course, and not too many years ago, found out that in the last couple of years, that the head of the Ministry of Defense in Canada, a wonderful man, the Honorable Paul Hellyer, who had been head of their Ministry of Defense in Canada, similarly had never been told about operations that were going on in joint U.S.-Canadian operations dealing with the UFO and extraterrestrial issue. And so this is not speculation. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's just the way it is. And so I tell people that's why the Disclosure Project became such an indispensable third project. You have the general public, you have the government, of the various governments of the world, but there need to be another element brought forward, and this other element had to be a group that was willing to be a leadership group to not only articulate the secrecy and expose it, but also pull together hundreds of these sort of top-secret people and at least have a few dozen of them come out en masse all at once. And if you look at the materials, for example, we have a 4-hour and also a 2-hour DVD that has these military witnesses speaking about what they had seen in secret projects dealing with UFOs. We also have a book called Disclosure, and it's almost 600 pages of top-secret documents, transcripts of the testimony of these top-secret military and intelligence and corporate witnesses. And it's all in there. And you can go to disclosureproject.org and get it. And people tell me, when is disclosure going to happen? I said, we did it. It's already been done. Because what's interesting is that when I first started briefing the CIA director and people like that in the early 90s, only about a third of the public thought that any of this could be true. 20-30%. Now, it depends on which poll you see. It's more than half, and up to 80% of the public think that we're not alone, that there's intelligent life in the universe, that some aspect of the government is lying about what UFOs are, et cetera, and so on. So there's been this huge shift to where now it's really a minority of the public who do not think that this is the case. And I point this out only to say that there's been enormous progress, and in a sense, even though there's not been an official disclosure from the U.S. government, there has been disclosure because our group did it. And we did it because no one else was willing to do it. One of the things I want people to understand very, very clearly, because this is often missed in these discussions when I'm interviewed on radio and television programs, is that we offered this first to the legitimate governments of the world, the United Nations, the G7 countries, the United States government, the Congress, the President. They didn't want to touch it, either out of fear or whatever. And once we determined, and there's a letter that's in a book that I wrote in 1999, but the letter was written in 1998, and it was The book is called Extraterrestrial Contact, The Evidence and Implications. It's the first book I ever wrote, and that's also available at disclosureproject.org. And in that book are the briefings I did for the CIA director and the position papers and the assessments and the early CSETI contact events that led up to all of this. But in that also is a letter where I wrote to the heads of all the branches of the U.S. government and said that unless otherwise directed, our assessment is as follows. Number one, that there is a illegal, rogue, secret government operation dealing with UFOs and extraterrestrial intelligence, which is lying to the President and to the Congress and the oversight committees. And therefore, number two, since it is rogue and illegal and lying to the chain of command, we are declaring that group illegal and soliciting the testimony of top-secret military personnel, as well as soliciting their documents, any government documents they may have, whether or not they've been declassified through the declassification process, and that we are going to bring them out to the public. And that, number three, we will put all of this together and disclose it as a civilian entity, bypassing the channels of the governments of the world because they have failed to act. No one wrote to me from any branch of the government, not the FBI, Department of Justice, CIA, Department of Defense, and said, your assessment is wrong and don't do it. And so we did it. So between 1998 and 2001, we put together the Disclosure Project, put together all these dozens of witnesses, very courageous men and women, and the documents to prove it, and did the Disclosure Project National Press Club event, which, of course, you can see on the Internet. It's all over the place on YouTube and disclosureproject.org and elsewhere. So that's sort of the backstory of what happened between 1993 and 2001, of how it all started, and why, in a sense, we were forced, not forced, but we had no other option except to let the secrecy continue. Because if you have leaders who aren't courageous enough to do what they need to do because they're afraid of retribution or afraid of whatever, then the people have to do it themselves. And this is, in a democracy, I've always felt that if the people will lead, the leaders will follow, that the sort of the ruling class or lagging indicators, they usually come along later. And this is why we needed to create a mass public movement for disclosure, exopolitics, contact, all of this, because the government itself had dropped the ball, and that within the government was a secret government that was basically hiding all this from the people we elect and appoint. And so it was such a dysfunctional situation that we felt the only thing left to do was for us to do disclosure, so we did.
Well, that process that you talked about of declaring the secrecy illegal was key in allowing these witnesses to feel free to come forward, because virtually all of them had signed secrecy agreements.
Yeah, in fact, every single one of them had, and many of them, of course, had top-secret clearances, so SCI, Special Compartmented Intelligence, and they were, many of them, very afraid of coming forward. And one of the things we did was to be sure that none of them came forward by themselves. Number one, there's security in numbers. Number two, there's credibility in numbers. And number three, if you have millions of people who see what you're doing out in broad daylight in disclosing this, it's very difficult for a cabal of secretive people to engage in retribution, because it would be noted by too many millions of people. So the security, the strategic security for what we were doing really necessitated the public being involved, which is what we did. Prior to the big event in Washington, D.C. in 2001, when we did the National Press Club event, we began to inform the public that we were going to do this. And that's why when we did it, there was every network camera in the world there. It was being watched live by huge numbers of people. In fact, so much so that every T1 line in D.C. was used up. The people who hosted the event out of the National Press Club said it was the most watched Internet broadcasts in history at that time, up to 2001, and that it dwarfed anything that even CNN and the Department of Defense, who they also hosted, the company that was hosting us, hosted those organizations. So they have never seen anything like that. In fact, afterwards, the head of that group brought me into their headquarters and showed me a graph of what the band usage was and the numbers of people watching the Disclosure Project event versus the most watched Department of Defense Pentagon event or the most watched CNN event at that time. Now, this is 2001. So what people have to understand, it made history in many, many ways, even technologically. But the beauty of that, of course, was that, you cannot, the people who normally try to, intimidate a witness or keep something secret one person at a time or one document at a time, they can't do this when you're doing it with dozens or hundreds of people. I mean, we had at the time that we went public in 2001, we had 110 of these military and intelligence witnesses from not just the United States, from Europe and all over the world. So it becomes something that it's almost unstoppable. And that's what happened.
You're talking about, the huge impact that it made at the National Press Club. I remember the people at the front desk of the National Press Club asking me, what is going on in there? They said, first of all, a lot of times we have, a lot of different representatives and reporters of the various news agencies come to an event, but they never stay for the whole thing. They said these people are, they've come, they're staying, and they said, and we never hear applause coming out of there, and they were continually applauding at things you and the witnesses said during that whole event. I mean, the room was packed.
Yeah, it was packed, and in fact, the media that were there were applauding these witnesses coming forward, which is very unusual. And the other thing that was very unusual is that, there were people from NBC and Fox and other networks there going, oh, my God, this is the real X-Files. It was sort of hilarious. But because they realized that these were real bona fide. I mean, we had, colonels. We had people from all walks of life, every branch of the armed forces, every agency, CIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, people who worked in all kinds of top secret positions coming forward. And I think that what happened was that people realized that, my God, this is the real thing. Interestingly, a little side note, the first hour of that was electronically jammed so that nothing could leave the National Press Club building in Washington. It did eventually get put out, but only after a delay. And we know, in fact, the people who hosted this said they had never had something like that happen, and it was quite clear that there was an electronic warfare targeting of the event to try to delay what was going out because there were so many people trying to get online to see it. Anyway, such is the case, and certainly history was made, and it subsequently launched the global disclosure effort, and has led now to a situation where upwards of 80% of the public believe that we're not alone and know about this issue. And it has also, what's very encouraging, enabled many other governments to step forward further than the U.S. government has.
That's right. I was just, thinking off the top of my head, a list of some of the countries that have released their secret UFO files now, and ones that I could just think of were Brazil most recently, France, Britain, Ireland, the Russian Navy, Mexico. If not all of their files, they've certainly released a lot of their top secret, and most recently some camera footage taken out of planes in the Mexico airport.
Right, and also Denmark has opened their files. And what's interesting is that, 2 or 3 years ago when the French government, their space agency, released some 100,000 pages of sightings and events. And of course, now we have similar things happening with the United Kingdom. And Chile also, their Air Force opened up their files and came forward with information. And and as I mentioned, Denmark just in the last few months. So what we're seeing is that there is this sort of movement amongst official governments. I mean, these are not civilians getting things out. These are official government releases that are happening right now. And, of course, even the Vatican in the last year making statements to the effect that, regarding extraterrestrial intelligence and the fact that extraterrestrials exist and what have you. And so I think that what you're seeing is whether it's the Vatican or whether it's the governments in Europe and around the world, they're all wanting to have the secrecy end and have this information come out. The hardest nut to crack has been the United States, because this is where not only a quarter of the world economic output is happening, but also where all the super secret, most of the super secret technological programs are going on that deal with the sciences related to extraterrestrial technologies. And I think that this is a huge issue that we'll get into in a moment. But I think that one of the problems is that the other problem I have found is that because some of these other countries are much smaller, they don't have $100 or $200 billion black budget. A lot of people don't realize that the United States black budget, what gets basically disappears through the Department of Defense. I think Rumsfeld himself said $2 or $3 trillion had vanished through the Department of Defense over the years, $1 trillion. That these amounts of funds amounts of money exceed the entire defense budgets of any other country in the world. In other words, we lose more than most any other country spends. And so when I say lose, it is unaccounted for going into these super secret projects. And so it's a very difficult thing to manage. And I think that one of the things the public has to understand is just because you get elected president of the United States or a senator from some state or get appointed to be the head of the CIA or even the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, it doesn't mean that you have command and control over those operations. This is the thing that's gotten out of control. I liken it to sort of in the 50s, there was a Frankenstein we created that Eisenhower warned us about, the military-industrial complex, and it's really the military-industrial financial complex because the Rockefeller family was very key in reorganizing the Department of Defense and the CIA in the mid-50s. There was a Rockefeller Commission, I think in 55 or 56, I have to look at my notes, and basically they reorganized all of these big bureaucracies so that they could outwit the appointed and elected officials, and they did so very successfully. And so what you have now is a situation, unfortunately, where you have this massive bureaucracy, and within it you can hide all kinds of things going on. And it's sort of, the public simply doesn't realize, and certainly the mainstream media will not report, that there has been a sort of disconnect between the required oversight of Congress and the President and many of these kinds of projects that are, spending countless billions a year in super secret operations. So much so that the entity that is running this issue today isn't even, in a sense, beholden or part of the United States government. It's its own international or transnational entity that has tentacles in many governments around the world and also the financial sector, because one of the things people have to understand is that the secrecy related to this issue is in no small part related to the macroeconomic power in the world, and that is who runs the world. And it's this very basic question. And if you bring out sciences and technologies, or the evidence of that we're being visited by civilizations that have sciences and technologies that permit faster than the speed of light travel and what have you, suddenly the $600 trillion financial sector that deals with futures trading in commodities and derivatives and oil and coal and utilities and centralized utilities and the petrodollar, and all of that becomes very much redundant, not necessary. And I think that you have to ask the question, who has an interest in maintaining that status quo? Well, it isn't necessarily the President of the United States or the Congress, and it's not necessarily even in the United States per se, but it's global, and it is a global financial concern. And so that's really where the problem is, and this is what I learned, of course, in the early 1990s. And it's a story that most people really become rather unsettled by hearing, but it's important that people hear it because they have to understand what we're up against. And the good news, of course, is that we have successfully done disclosure, and now it's reached a point where the momentum around the world is inexorable, sort of push towards opening files, releasing information, reporting on the issue, even in the mainstream media increasingly when events happen, such as the one Linda mentioned, the one that happened in the last month or so. I believe it was in December. There was this announcement by the Minister of Defense in Mexico where they released the gun camera footage, and the footage taken by their flight crews, their Air Force, of these UFOs over Mexico. And that was that was not a leak. That was an official release by the Mexican government and the Ministry of Defense from their Air Force and their military, which is really historic, by the way. I mean, and it did get reported on, CNN and Fox and other media outlets. So this is happening. And so what we're seeing is that throughout the world, there is an opening up of this subject. The hard nut to crack is in the U.S., and that's because there is a decapitation of the control of these projects away from the Oval Office and the President and the Congress. And that is not a totally unique situation. There are certainly super secret projects that go on in the United Kingdom and France and even Russia and China that their governmental heads are lied to about or kept out of the loop on, but not to the extent that there is here. Because as I mentioned, the amount of money we put into black projects that, quote, don't exist exceeds the entire defense budgets of any other nation in the world. And when you think about that, that's a problem.
Huge problem.
So, this year, for example, the Department of Defense budget, not counting the CIA and other intelligence entities, is going to be $708 billion. So it's very easy to hide $100 or $200 billion in there and have it siphoned off into these kind of operations. And unfortunately, we've also mapped how that's happening through a lot of the corporate entities that work on these very secret projects. And there's sort of a revolving door between super secret military and intelligence operations and large corporate programs.
A lot of these countries that are coming forward with their secret UFO files are South American or Mexican. Uruguay's another one, by the way, on the list. Why do you think it's a more open subject in Latin America?
Well, I think one reason it's more open in Latin America is, number one, they have very, very small militaries. Number two, there isn't this, as I mentioned, this large, unacknowledged, super secret operation. And so there is more of an intact chain of command on these issues. And number three, they don't have as big a vested interest in the global economy, in the petrodollar, in the energy sector, the conventional energy sector that you see in the United States, Europe, and the Middle East. And so this would all move it towards a position of wanting to be more open about those sorts of events, although there certainly are classified projects in those countries, but they wouldn't necessarily be known. The conventional military and conventional governments down in Latin America and also a number of other countries, when they do get information, are now more inclined to open it up and share it. But sometimes they will be approached by people who are senior in this so-called Majestic group, what used to be called Majestic 12. MAJIC is one of the code names that I have on a top-secret National Reconnaissance Office document. And they will be approached and persuaded. How they're persuaded, well, is anyone's guess. threats, intimidations, and inducements to keep something secret. And that certainly does happen around the world. I want people to understand that the secrecy has a global reach. But the official governments of many of these countries do not have really much interest in maintaining the secrecy. The other issue is that, in many of these countries where they don't have as corrupt a big mainstream media, you can have events happen that get reported very rapidly. For example, in Mexico and other Latin American countries, there will be mass sightings of a UFO or an event, and it'll be in their media right away. That didn't happen here. It didn't happen, and now it's starting to change. But you look at the things that happened in the so-called Phoenix Lights, that happened in March, and it really didn't break into national news, but only fitfully through some leaks in June of that year. And then they had people coming out saying they were flares from the National Guard doing some exercises or whatnot, which was a total cover-up. Right. So what you find is that in Latin American countries, not only when we would go, for example, to parts of Mexico, we would go to towns that had 100,000 people in it, and 90% of the people had seen the things. They had seen these UFOs coming out of the volcano at Popo. So the question became, I think for many of these countries that are smaller, they don't have these huge centralized military-industrial complex sectors. The media there tend to report these things much more readily, if not in real time. That it's much harder for these governments to maintain any credibility by going along with the cover-up. Now, in the United States, you have until very recently had the opposite. You have, if the media, the big media in the United States deals with this at all, it's usually with derision and ridicule, or at least with a ha-ha factor. Or they'll put somebody on who's an expert on the UFO subject who really doesn't know anything, and they'll have someone who's a debunker on there who seems very polished and has high credentials.
Right.
And you see people who really do know the truth, like many of our top secret witnesses in our project, will be blacklisted out of the mainstream media because they don't want the truth told to the public. So the media in the United States and much of Europe, the big media and internet, are very, very corrupt and often do not delve into these things. So, and when they do, they're approached by some people who are told, stay away from this, don't do it. And I know this because I've seen it happen. For example, a senior producer with ABC News, the executive producer, in fact, came to my home here before the Disclosure Project and said, look, this is the biggest story in history if it's true. And so I gave him 35 hours of testimony of these top secret military witnesses, as well as documents and a whole lot of material. And he said, boy, we want to do a story on this on Primetime Live in 2020 and do a town hall sort of thing with a lot of these witnesses there and telling their stories to the public and all this. And, he assured me he was the guy in charge and he could make it happen. And shortly after the Disclosure Project press conference in 2001, he calls me up and he says, well, Dr. Greer, they won't let me do this. And I said, what do you mean? Who are they? And he said, Dr. Greer, you know who they are. So he was absolutely slapped down from being able to do this at ABC News. I've had the same thing happen in big Hollywood producers who wanted to do films on this, true documentaries. I've had the same thing happen with other networks, people who've worked with 60 Minutes at CBS, and et cetera, and so on. So I've had first-hand witness myself to the kind of suppression that happens through the large media here. And you see in Latin America, that's less likely to happen.
Well, even after the press conference at the National Press Club, a lot of the reporters there were very excited about it, and they took our witnesses aside and filmed them separately. And these were reporters from mainstream shows like Primetime Live, 2020, 48 Hours, filming and interviewing our witnesses themselves because they had the intention of putting that on one of their shows, and strangely enough, it never aired.
They were ordered not to. Now,
right.
After this, I was given a document. It's up on our website, disclosureproject.org, where you can get the books I just mentioned. You can get these 4-hour DVDs of the witnesses. You can get the 2-hour DVDs. You can get a 1-hour. You can get the National Press Club event itself. It's at disclosureproject.org. And you can get this nearly 600-page book called Disclosure that has all of this in there. I tell people, anyone who really wants to prove to someone this stuff is real, everything is at disclosureproject.org. Now, what's interesting is that when we were analyzing this in the aftermath, I had a document sent to me that was a CIA document that I understand had accidentally been declassified, but it was dated from 1991 during the end of the first Bush presidency, Papa Bush. And in this document, the CIA is boasting that they have assets in all the wire services, major media, magazines, networks to change or delay stories and alter stories so that they come out to their favor, to what the CIA wants to have happen. And this is, I wrote an article called Media Play that's up on disclosureproject.org, and to it is linked this top secret, this document that got declassified, and I understand was later reclassified during the Cheney years, but we have it, and it's up on our website, and it's an unmistakable admission of the corruption of the mainstream media by the intelligence services. And so the question then has to be asked, how free of a press do we really have when you talk about the large mainstream media in America and Europe? I think not much. But that's changing also. Little by little, they're letting some things come out. But it's very baby steps at this point. And this is one of the reasons why we say people need to go to disclosureproject.org. The information is there so they can write to President Obama and to their 2 senators and member of Congress and say, look, we want this information out. We want the technologies that at least for energy generation to begin to come out. We want a peaceful diplomatic program to contact these interstellar visitors and to demilitarize that response so it doesn't exist within a small clique of militarist-oriented people. And that this needs to happen. It should have never been classified. As Senator Barry Goldwater said to me as I was sitting in his living room, he said it was a goddamn mistake then, and it's a goddamn mistake now that this was ever secret. I'm quoting. He was a pretty blunt guy. And I said, yes, Senator, you're right. But what are we going to do about it? So, and so what I have found is that it takes a lot of public activism and grassroots activism, and that's what disclosureproject.org enables you to do if you go there and see what we're recommending. So it's really quite exciting, though, to see that countries around the world are moving forward without the United States. We're hoping President Obama, who's now been in office just right at a year, will get his hands around the reins of this issue and have the courage to do what none of his predecessors have, and that is get control of these classified projects. I will tell you that in the briefing that I did for Obama that was sent to him and to his new CIA director, Leon Panetta, to the House Intelligence Committee chairman, to the Secretary of Defense, Gates, and to others, senior people in the administration. This briefing has documents in it with project code names and code numbers and locations and facilities, etc., so that if they wish, they can get involved and get control of these programs. Now, it takes a lot of courage. There will be attempts to dissuade the president from doing this. I'm sure there will be all kinds of saber rattling and all kinds of other tricks. But ultimately, the public need to weigh in on this and ask the president to do the courageous and right thing, and to remind him of what Robert Kennedy said, and that is that the really indispensable quality is moral courage to be able to make real change happen. And it is time for this. I think 60 years or more than 60 years of this kind of secrecy is too long. and it's made a mockery out of the government. When you have upwards of 80% of the public knows this stuff is real, and the government keeps just denying that, Roswell was a weather balloon or whatever it was. I mean, it just causes the government to look ridiculous, and people know better. And now you have all these other governments, and not just Latin American governments, but European allies releasing documents. It just makes the United States look like a backwater of silliness. And so people need to write to the president and say, look, we need to catch up with France and United Kingdom and Denmark and these other countries and begin to open up this issue in a credible way, and also begin to phase in these earth-saving and life-saving technologies. As I look at the devastation around the world environmentally, or even the devastation in Haiti, you want to rebuild that country, they don't have fuel to even move the trucks around. And it's because we're still on this 1800s paradigm of fossil fuel supplies and centralized electric power grids. And this is all things, of course, the OrionProject.org are working on to replace. And thank God we have a wonderful scientist who's worked in many top-secret programs, who's now working with us to build up at least an introductory level energy generation system that we hope to have some announcements on sometime this spring or maybe summer. But the President of the United States definitely needs to weigh in on this, and so do members of Congress. And that's how people listening to the World Puja Network can get involved, is they can share this interview with people in their address book, and then also get people to go to disclosureproject.org and write to the President. All the information is there, and the links are there, and educate themselves about this really, really important issue.
Another amazing thing people can download on disclosureproject.org is the 6-page cover letter that you wrote for the Obama briefing, and it is the most concise explanation of this entire subject that anyone could possibly want.
Yeah, and it's up there now. We did not release that until a couple of months ago at the end of October, about 3 months ago, less than 3 months ago now. But it is up there at disclosureproject.org, and I would encourage people to read that. It's a very comprehensive overview, and remember that 6-page overview that I did for the President, what else was sent to him were all these other documents and evidence and what have you. But much of that can be had also at the Disclosure Project, and Disclosure Project, all one word, .org, is where you can go to see that, but also to get the Disclosure Project book, The Hidden Truth, Forbidden Knowledge book that also recounts the history of all this, and also the original book that has all these top-secret documents and these sort of briefings that I did for the CIA director are in the book Extraterrestrial Contact, The Evidence and Implications. So those are out there, as well as the new one that is called Contact, Countdown to Transformation. And Contact, Countdown to Transformation, we just released a couple months ago. It has a DVD with it that shows the kind of amazing encounters we've been having all over the world with these extraterrestrial civilizations, and the kind of wonderful things that people can expect into the future as we move into a true interstellar and transdimensional society.
And the Witness DVDs are amazing. You just can't deny when you see these men and a few women also talking on camera, you just can't deny that they're telling the truth.
Right, and it is dispositive. I mean, it's dispositive proof, and there's no question between the documents and the testimony. I mean, if you had one person telling this account, but if you have dozens and dozens of them, and I think the book alone, the Disclosure book alone, has something like 69 of these sorts of witnesses in them.
The stories are amazing. They're wonderful stories. I mean, they're you'll enjoy the stories. They're not dry reading. They're really touching. Many of them are very touching. They're really amazing stories.
And what's interesting, after you go through all that material, it's only about 10% of what we have. But of course, most people aren't going to read a 10,000-page book, so you have to kind of make the cut somewhere. But it's enough to get people fully informed, I believe. We selected the cases that are in there for a reason. So all that is there, and it's there for people to study, and that's what we've done, is to put this together so people can learn and know the truth. So, well, I think we're about up with our time. The hour went by very quickly. Thank you, Linda, and I'd like to thank the folks at the World Puja Network for hosting us. And this is Dr. Stephen Greer with Conversations with Dr. Greer, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks. Until then, keep looking up, and look forward to speaking to you then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.